The dark wasn't empty. It was heavy. It pressed against my eyelids, absolute and suffocating, smelling of crushed stone and old iron. I tried to inhale, but the air was thick with dust that coated my throat like dry ash, choking off the scream that wanted to climb out. My legs were pinned. I couldn't tell by what, rock, timber, the earth itself, but the pressure was a dull, throbbing fact that anchored me to the ground. Panic wasn't a wave, it was a rising tide, cold and inevitable. I had made a mistake, a fatal, stupid mistake. The weight of the mountain seemed to settle on my chest. Just as the terror began to fracture my thoughts, a beam of light sliced through the black. It was blinding, violent in the gloom, cutting a path through the swirling dust. Then came the voice, low, calm, anchoring. I see you. Don't move. I didn't go up that mountain looking for trouble. I went looking for the absence of everything else. My life back in the city had become a series of relentless inputs. Screens glowing at 3 a.m., the constant low-level hum of anxiety that passes for ambition, the noise of 1,000 conversations that didn't matter. I needed a hard reset. I needed silence that wasn't just a pause between noises, but a physical thing, a weight I could wrap myself in. The old mining outpost was supposed to be that place. It sat on the map like a scar, abandoned 40 years ago, restricted, dangerous, and perfect. The drive up had been a shedding of skins. The pavement turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to ruts that threatened to swallow the tires of my rental. When the road ended, I walked. The air up there was thin and smelled of sagebrush and sun-baked pine. It was sharp in my lungs, cleansing. I climbed the perimeter fence with a shameful amount of ease, ignoring the no trespassing sign that had rusted into illegibility. Inside, the site was a ghost town of industrial skeletons. The headframe of the main shaft stood against the sky, a monument to forgotten labor. It was beautiful in the way only ruined things can be, stripped of purpose, left to simply exist. I spent an hour just walking the perimeter, tracing the lines of decay. The ground was a patchwork of stone and dry earth, hard-packed and unforgiving. The silence I wanted was there. It was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. No traffic, no notifications, just the wind moving through the skeleton of the processing plant and the occasional creak of settling wood. I felt a smug satisfaction. I was alone. I was in control. I was an observer of history, untouched by the chaos I'd left behind. I remember stopping near what looked like an old ventilation shaft, capped with rotting timber. The wood was gray, bleached by decades of high-altitude sun. It looked solid enough. That was the arrogance speaking. The city brain that assumes the ground is always concrete, that safety is a default setting. I stepped onto the platform to get a better look at the valley below. The view was staggering. A sprawling canvas of green and granite that made my own problems feel microscopic. I took a breath, tasting the freedom of it. Then, physics asserted itself. There was no warning creak, no movie-style groan of wood, just a sharp, dry crack, like a gunshot. The world dropped. Gravity, which had been a constant, suddenly became a predator. The sensation of falling is shorter than you think. It's a blur of motion and a stomach-dropping lurch. I hit the slope below the platform, slid, and then the ground beneath that gave way too, funneling me down into the throat of the earth. I tumbled through darkness, debris raining down around me, rocks, splinters of wood, the dust of half a century. I slammed into something hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me in a brutal rush. Then silence returned. But it wasn't the peaceful silence of the mountain anymore. It was the suffocating, ringing silence of a tomb. I lay there, stunned, the pain blooming slowly in my ankle and ribs. The transition was absolute. 1 minute, I was a tourist in a dead world. The next, I was part of the wreckage. I tried to sit up, and the debris shifted with a menacing groan. That's when the reality settled in, heavier than the rocks pinning my legs. I wasn't an observer anymore. I was trapped. And nobody knew I was here. The regret was primal, a bitter taste in my mouth that had nothing to do with the dust. I had wanted silence, and the mountain had given it to me, permanent and terrifying. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight, pressing down with the crushing density of the earth itself. It tasted of iron and stale time. Every breath I took was a negotiation with the dust, a dry, gritty intake that coated my tongue and burned its way down to my lungs. I lay there, pinned and paralyzed, listening to the ragged sound of my own respiration. It was too loud in the confined space, a frantic staccato rhythm that betrayed the terror clawing at my throat. My ankle throbbed, a hot, pulsing signal of pain that seemed to be the only colorful thing in a world turned entirely to shades of black. Time became a fluid, terrifying concept. Minutes could have been hours. I tried to keep my mind from spiraling, tried to focus on the simple mechanics of breathing, but the silence was a living thing. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. It amplified the shifting of the debris above me, the groan of settling timber that sounded like the mountain clearing its throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, a useless gesture in the absolute dark, and tried to make myself small. I was a trespasser here, a soft, city-bred thing intruding on the skeletal remains of a hard, dangerous history. The shame of it burned almost as hot as my ankle. I had come here to escape the noise of my life, and I had found a silence so profound it threatened to erase me entirely. Then the rhythm of the mountain changed. It wasn't the random clatter of falling stone or the creak of wood. It was rhythmic, deliberate. A heavy, metallic thud scrape that vibrated through the rock against my cheek. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sound grew louder, closer, a steady, mechanical percussion cutting through the chaotic stillness. It was the sound of intention. A beam of light sliced the darkness. It was violent in its brightness, a solid bar of white that cut through the swirling dust motes like a laser. I flinched, turning my face away, blinded by the sudden assault on my dilated pupils. The light swept over the wreckage, clinical and searching, before snapping back to pin me. I see you. The voice was low, resonant, and startlingly calm. It didn't have the frantic pitch of a rescuer who was afraid. It held the absolute, terrifying authority of someone who knew exactly how bad this was and didn't care. It anchored the chaos instantly. "Stay down," the voice commanded. "Do not try to shift your weight." I blinked, tears of dust and shock streaming down my face, trying to focus on the source of the light. A silhouette detached itself from the gloom above, sliding down the slope of debris with a controlled, fluid grace. She didn't scramble. She moved with a terrifying precision, boots finding purchase on unstable rock, her body shifting to counterbalance the slide. The sound of her movement was heavy, the clink of carabiners, the rustle of heavy canvas, the crunch of boots on stone. She stopped 3 feet from me, crouched low. The light from her headlamp was blinding, creating a halo around her that left her face in shadow, but I could see the outline of her gear. Heavy jacket, harness, helmet. She was a wall of professional competence in a world that had dissolved into disaster. "My name is Renee," she said. Her voice was a physical vibration in the small space, dry and unflinching. "I'm the rescue chief. I need you to look at me and breathe. Can you do that?" I tried to nod, but a sob caught in my throat, turning into a hacking cough. Panic was still trying to drag me under, a cold current pulling at my limbs. I was shaking, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that rattled my teeth. Renee moved then. She closed the distance between us, not with comfort, but with efficiency. She reached out, and her hand found my wrist. The contact was electric. Through the thick leather of her glove, I could feel the heat of her palm, the solid, unyielding pressure of her grip. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a claim. She wasn't holding my hand. She was taking my pulse, anchoring me to the reality of her presence. The shock of it snapped the panic like a dry twig. "Pulse is thready," she murmured, more to herself than me. Her thumb pressed harder against my skin, a demand for circulation, for life. "You're going into shock. Focus on my voice. The air is thin, but it's there. Breathe." I stared up at the silhouette, unable to see her eyes but feeling the weight of her gaze. It was heavy, assessing, stripping away the layers of my fear to see the damage underneath. I wasn't a person to her in that moment. I was a problem to be solved, a variable in a dangerous equation. And God, the relief of that was staggering. I didn't have to be brave. I didn't have to be in control. I just had to let her hold me. "I've got you," she said. And the certainty in her tone settled into my bones, heavier than the rock, deeper than the dark. "We're getting out of here." "This is going to hurt," she said. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same neutral cadence she might use to read a weather report. She didn't wait for me to brace myself. She didn't offer a countdown. Renee simply shifted her stance, planting her boots wide in the shifting scree, and drove her shoulder into the timber, pinning my leg. The wood groaned, a wet, tearing sound that vibrated through my bones. Then the pressure vanished, replaced instantly by a rush of agony so sharp and white-hot that my vision grays out. I think I screamed, but the sound was lost in the clatter of the beam hitting the wall. Before I could collapse into the pain, she was there. Her hands were on me, not comforting, but hauling. She grabbed the front of my jacket, bunching the material in her fist, and pulled me upright. The movement was jarring, stealing the air from my lungs, but it forced me to focus. "Legs," she commanded. "Use the good one. Lean on me. Do not pass out." I scrambled for purchase, my good boot finding a ridge of stone. I collapsed against her, my face buried in the rough, heavy canvas of her turnout coat. It smelled of damp earth, diesel, and something sharper, adrenaline and old sweat. It was the smell of work. She didn't buckle under my weight. She felt solid, like a pillar of iron driven into the loose rock. Her arm came around my waist, a clamp of steel that held me so tight it was almost bruising. "We move now," she said, her voice vibrating against my chest. "The ceiling is unstable." The exit route wasn't a walk. It was a crawl through the throat of the mountain. The collapse had narrowed the shaft to a jagged fissure that required us to move as a single, awkward organism. There was no room for modesty or hesitation. I had to press myself against her, molding my body to the hard lines of hers to fit through the gaps. At one point, the ceiling dipped so low we had to crouch. I was behind her, my chest pressed against her back, my hands gripping her shoulders to keep from sliding into the dark. I could feel the heat of her exertion radiating through her layers. Every time she moved, I felt the shift of muscle, the incredible coiled tension of her strength. She was doing the work for both of us, using her body as a wedge, a lever, a shield. I could hear her breathing, sharp, controlled exhalations that matched the rhythm of her boots finding traction. "Keep moving," she grunted when I faltered, my injured ankle dragging through the dust. "Don't stop." The intimacy of it was terrifying. In the dark, with the dust choking us, the boundaries of personal space evaporated. I was inhaling her scent, clinging to her frame, entirely dependent on the capability of her body to save mine. It was a raw, primal proximity that stripped away every defense I had left. I wasn't the polished professional from the city anymore. I was just a terrified animal seeking warmth. And she was the fire. Then the air changed. The stale, dead taste of the mine was cut by a sudden, sharp draft of cold. It smelled of water and ozone. "Almost there," she said. And for the first time, I heard a fraction of strain in her voice. We scrambled up the final slope of debris. The darkness began to bleed into gray. It wasn't sunlight. It was the heavy, bruised purple of a storm. We burst out of the ground and into the world, and the sensory overload nearly knocked me flat again. The silence of the mine was shattered by the roar of wind. Rain was falling in sheets, cold and stinging, turning the dust on my skin to mud instantly. The light was blindingly flat, devoid of shadows. I gasped, sucking in the wet, freezing air, my lungs burning with the sudden expansion. Renee didn't stop to admire the weather. She didn't let go. If anything, her grip tightened. The ground outside was slick with mud, treacherous in a different way than the dry rock below. She shifted her grip, hauling me closer until I was tucked under her arm, shielding me from the worst of the wind with her own body. She handled me with a rough, efficient care, like I was a piece of critical equipment that had been damaged but was still salvageable. "Truck is 50 yards," she shouted over the wind. "Can you walk?" I tried to step and my knee buckled. I didn't hit the ground. She caught me before gravity could claim me again, cursing softly. Without asking, she bent and swept my legs out from under me, lifting me into her arms. The indignity of it flashed through my mind and died instantly, replaced by the shock of being carried. She held me high against her chest, her stride eating up the muddy ground. I could feel the hammering of her heart against my ribs, a powerful, steady rhythm that felt like the only solid thing in the spinning world. She marched toward a battered field vehicle parked near the perimeter, a white trailer hitched to the back, rocking slightly in the gale. She didn't look at me. Her jaw was set, her eyes narrowed against the rain, focused entirely on the destination. I buried my face in the crook of her neck, shivering violently, overwhelmed by the cold, the pain, and the terrifying safety of her arms. We reached the trailer and she kicked the door open, carrying me out of the storm and into the sudden, jarring quiet of the interior. The door slammed shut, sealing out the roar of the wind and replacing it with a sudden, ringing quiet. The trailer was small, a utilitarian box of metal and fiberglass that smelled intensely of stale coffee, ozone, and damp wool. Renee didn't set me down gently. She deposited me onto a narrow, vinyl-covered bench bolted to the wall with the same efficient heaviness she'd used to haul me out of the ground. I slumped back against the metal wall, the adrenaline that had sustained me finally draining away, leaving behind a cold that seemed to radiate from the marrow of my bones. My teeth chattered with a violence that made my jaw ache. I watched as Renee stripped off her outer layer. She unclipped the heavy harness, letting it drop to the floor with a heavy clank, then peeled off the soaked turnout coat. Underneath, she wore a fitted thermal shirt, dark gray and clinging to the muscles of her arms and back. She was smaller without the gear, but denser, a compact coil of potential energy. She turned to me, her eyes scanning my shivering form with that terrifying clinical detachment. "You're hypothermic," she stated, grabbing a pair of shears from a magnetic strip on the wall. "And those clothes are ruined. We need to get them off before the cold sets in deeper." I nodded, my fingers fumbling uselessly at the zipper of my jacket. My hands were numb, clumsy blocks of wood that refused to obey the commands from my brain. I managed to drag the zipper down an inch before my fingers slipped. Renee watched me struggle for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stepped into my space. "Hands down," she ordered. It wasn't a request. She batted my hands away and took hold of the zipper. Her knuckles brushed the skin of my throat, hot and rough against my freezing flesh. In one smooth motion, she unzipped the jacket and peeled it off my shoulders. The wet denim of my jeans was next. She didn't ask for permission, and I didn't have the energy to offer it. She used the shears on the ruined fabric around my swollen ankle, the metal blades cool against my skin, snipping through the heavy material with precise snapping sounds. There is a specific kind of intimacy in being undressed by a stranger who is looking at you like a mechanic looks at an engine. It strips away the social performance of modesty. I sat there in my underwear, shivering violently, while she pulled the wet fabric away from my skin. The air in the trailer was warm, pumped from a heater humming in the corner, but I felt exposed, a raw nerve ending vibrating in the open air. Renee grabbed a heavy wool blanket from an overhead bin, military surplus, scratchy and smelling of storage, and draped it around my shoulders. She tucked it tight, her hands lingering for a fraction of a second on my upper arms to ensure the seal was good. "Sit still," she murmured. She turned to a metal cabinet, retrieving a first aid kit. She snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves, the sound sharp in the small space. "I need to clean the abrasions. This will sting." She pulled a rolling stool over, sitting between my legs with a casual proximity that made my breath hitch. She took my injured foot into her lap. Her touch through the gloves was firm, unyielding. She began to clean the scrapes on my shin with an alcohol wipe. The sting was sharp and sudden, but I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from making a sound. I didn't want to look weak, not in front of her. Renee worked with a focused silence. She scrubbed the dirt from my skin, her head bent, exposing the nape of her neck where dark hair had escaped her messy bun. I watched her hands. They were capable hands, scarred across the knuckles, steady as rock. She wasn't gentle in the way a mother is gentle. She was gentle in the way a master craftsman handles a volatile material. She respected the damage, but she didn't fear it. "Deep breath," she said, moving to the bruising on my ribs. She slid her hands under the blanket. The wool was rough, but her gloved fingers were smooth, probing the tender skin over my ribcage. "Does this hurt?" She pressed down. "Yes," I gasped, the word punching out of me. "Nothing feels broken," she assessed, her voice low. "Just battered." She didn't remove her hands immediately. She left them there, resting against my side, checking the rise and fall of my breath. The dynamic in the trailer shifted. The medical necessity was fading, replaced by a heavy, static charge. The space between us, her on the stool, me on the bench, her hands under my blanket, felt suddenly, dangerously small. I looked down at her, and she looked up. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and for the first time, the professional mask slipped. She wasn't just assessing a patient. She was looking at me. She saw the flush rising on my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. She saw the way my breathing had changed, shallow and quick, not from shock, but from the electric awareness of her proximity. The air thickened. The hum of the heater seemed to fade into the background, drowned out by the thudding of my own heart. I could smell her scent over the antiseptic, rain, sweat, and a faint, smoky note of vetiver. It was intoxicating. "You're warming up," she said softly. Her thumb brushed the skin just beneath my bra line, a motion that was absolutely not medical. It was a graze, a question. "I am," I whispered. My voice sounded wrecked, husky. Renee held my gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary, her eyes dropping to my lips before snapping back to my eyes. The tension was a pulled wire, humming, ready to snap. Then, with a visible effort, she pulled her hands back. She peeled off the gloves with a spell, breaking the spell. "Keep the blanket tight," she said, her voice returning to that dry command tone, though it sounded a little rougher around the edges now. "I'm going to make coffee. Don't move." She stood up and turned her back to me, moving toward the small kitchenette at the far end of the trailer. I pulled the scratchy wool tighter around myself, burying my nose in the fabric to hide the shaky exhale that escaped me. I was warm, yes, but the heat blooming in my stomach had nothing to do with the blanket. The smell of coffee began to fill the small space, bitter and dark, warring with the metallic tang of the storm outside. Renee stood with her back to me, watching the percolation with the same intensity she had applied to the mine shaft. The radio mounted under the cabinet crackled to life, a burst of static that sounded like frying fat, followed by a distorted voice. "Base to Unit 1. The access road is gone. Repeat, the wash has taken the culvert at mile marker 4. You're cut off until the water recedes. Over." Renee didn't flinch. She reached up, pressed the transmit button, and spoke into the handset. "Copy that, base. We're secure. Out." She released the button, and the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. She didn't turn around immediately. I watched the muscles in her back shift under the thin fabric of her thermal shirt as she poured 2 mugs. The reality of the transmission settled over me like a second blanket. We weren't going anywhere. The world outside had ceased to exist, reduced to a wall of wind and water. There was only this metal box, the hum of the heater, and the woman who had just pulled me out of the earth. She turned, carrying the mugs. Without the bulk of her turnout gear, the proportions of the trailer seemed to change. She took up less space physically, yet her presence felt larger, more concentrated. She walked over and set 1 mug on the small table bolted to the floor next to the bench, then sank into the chair opposite me. She sat with a sprawl that spoke of deep, bone-level exhaustion, legs stretched out, boots crossed at the ankles, holding her mug with both hands as if trying to draw the heat directly into her palms. "Road's washed out," she said, taking a sip. Her eyes met mine over the rim of the cup. "We're stuck until morning." "I heard," I managed to say. The coffee was hot, scalding my tongue, but the burn was grounding. "Is that normal? In this weather?" "Yeah." She lowered the mug. The harsh overhead light cast shadows under her cheekbones, highlighting the sharp geometry of her face. She looked tired, but it was a good kind of tired. The fatigue of a machine that has done exactly what it was designed to do. You picked a hell of a day for a hike. I didn't check the forecast, I admitted. I pulled the blanket tighter. The shivering had stopped, replaced by a low, vibrating hum of nerves. I just needed to get out of the city. Renee studied me. It wasn't the medical assessment anymore. It was curiosity, guarded but genuine. She leaned back, resting her head against the wall of the trailer. The storm hammered against the roof, a chaotic rhythm that made the quiet inside feel stolen, illicit. People don't come to the old mine for the view, she said. Her voice was lower now, stripped of the command tone she'd used in the shaft. It was rougher, textured like raw silk. They come because it's a dead zone. No signal, no people. What were you running from? The question hung in the air, suspended in the steam rising from our cups. I looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't wearing a uniform anymore. She was just a woman in a gray shirt, sitting in a storm, waiting for an answer. Noise, I said. The truth slipped out before I could polish it. I was running from the noise. My life, it felt like I was drowning in static. I thought if I could just find a place where the signal died, I could hear myself think again. Renee's expression didn't change, but her eyes softened at the corners. She looked down at her hands, tracing the rim of her mug with a calloused thumb. So you came to a place that tries to kill you. It seemed peaceful, I defended weakly. It is, she agreed. She looked up, and the intensity of her gaze pinned me again. That's the trick of it. The mountain doesn't care about your noise. It doesn't care about you at all. That's the only real silence there is. Indifference. Is that why you're here? I asked. Because it doesn't care? She paused, the question seeming to catch her off guard. She took a long drink of coffee, her throat working as she swallowed. I'm here because the stakes are simple, she said finally. In the city, you can make a mistake and nobody notices for weeks. Up here, you make a mistake, the mountain collects. It's honest. Brutal, I corrected. Honest, she insisted. A faint smile touched her lips, barely there, but it transformed her face. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a knowing one. I like the clarity. You either fix the problem or you don't. You either get out or you don't. And today, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, we got out. We did, she said. The air between us shifted again, the philosophical distance collapsing into physical awareness. The storm raged outside, battering the metal walls, but inside the tension was a quiet rising tide. We were two strangers trapped in a box, bound by a near-death experience and the impossibility of leaving. We got out. Coffee only does so much, Renee muttered, breaking the heavy quiet that had settled over us. She stood up, the movement fluid despite the exhaustion I knew she must be feeling. She moved to a different cabinet, a small, locked metal box secured near the floor. The key on her belt jingled, a sharp, domestic sound that felt strangely out of place in the command center. She unlocked it and pulled out a bottle. It had no label, just a dark, amber liquid that sloshed heavily against the glass. Medicinal, she said, catching my eye. The corner of her mouth twitched, a micro-expression that might have been a smirk. She didn't ask. She just poured a generous measure into my half-empty coffee mug, the liquor swirling into the dark brew, then topped off her own. Drink. It helps with the shakes, and it kills whatever bacteria I missed. I took the mug with both hands. The steam now smelled of roasted beans and peat smoke, a rich, earthy scent that seemed to warm the air before I even took a sip. I lifted it to my lips. The taste was a shock, bitter coffee colliding with the smooth, fiery burn of whiskey. It hit my stomach like a flare, radiating heat outward to my frozen extremities. Better? She asked, watching me. Potent, I managed, coughing slightly as the warmth bloomed in my chest. It does the job. She leaned back in her chair, taking a long pull from her own mug without flinching. I found that I couldn't stop looking at her hands. Now that the adrenaline was fading, my focus was sharpening, zeroing in on the details I had missed in the panic. Her hands were wrapped around the ceramic mug, fingers long and capable. They were fascinating maps of violence and repair. There was a jagged white line running across her left knuckles, a souvenir from some past disaster. A burn scar, shiny and smooth, curled around her wrist like a bracelet. Her nails were short, utilitarian, and her palms were thick with calluses that caught on the rough ceramic. They were hands that did things. Hands that broke things and fixed things. An hour ago, those same hands had dug through rock and timber to find me. They had gripped my wrist with a force that promised survival. They had stripped the wet clothes from my body with a detached, professional efficiency. But watching them now, relaxed against the warm mug, I felt a sudden sharp pull in my chest, a magnetic drag toward that capability. I caught myself wondering what those rough palms would feel like if they weren't saving my life. What they would feel like if they were touching me for a different reason entirely. "You're staring," she said. Her voice was low, cutting through my thoughts. She didn't look away. She held my gaze, unflinching. "I'm analyzing," I lied, taking another sip of the spiked coffee to hide the flush rising in my cheeks. "You're wondering how a woman ends up living in a tin can on top of a collapsing mountain," she corrected, a dry amusement coloring her tone. "Go ahead, ask. You city types always want the tragic backstory to make the trip worthwhile." "I wasn't going to say tragic," I shot back, the whiskey emboldening me. I lowered the mug to my lap, clutching it like a shield. I was going to say intense. You don't exactly scream people person. You live in a disaster zone on purpose. Renee laughed then. It was a low, raspy sound that vibrated in the small room, transforming her face. The harsh lines around her eyes softened, and for a second, she looked younger, less like a monument to survival and more like a person. "I'm excellent with people," she countered, a playful glint in her gray eyes. "As long as they're unconscious or terrified. It's the small talk I'm bad at. I don't do well with dinner parties. I don't know what to do with my hands if I'm not fixing something." "You seem to be managing fine right now," I observed. "That's because you're still in shock," she teased, taking another sip. "You're a captive audience, and you're currently wearing my blanket, so I win by default." "I could leave," I bluffed, glancing at the door where the rain was still hammering like shrapnel. "You could," she agreed, her gaze dropping to my bare legs sticking out from under the wool, then traveling slowly back up to my face. It was a slow, deliberate sweep that felt like a physical touch. "But you wouldn't make it 10 feet. You're a city girl. You'd drown in a puddle before you reached the main road." "I'm tougher than I look," I argued, though the heat in my face was betraying me. "I know," she said. The teasing tone vanished, replaced by that heavy, serious cadence she had used in the mine. "I felt you holding on in the dark. You didn't panic when it counted. Most people do." The compliment hit me incarcerated than the whiskey. I looked down into my mug, suddenly unable to meet her eyes. "I'm fine," I whispered, the standard deflection falling from my lips. "I'm just tired." "Liar," she murmured. I looked up. She had leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, bringing her face closer to mine. The space between us seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and static. She wasn't looking at the survivor anymore. She was looking at the woman beneath the blanket. "You're not fine," she said softly. "You're unraveling. I can see it. You're holding yourself together with caffeine and stubbornness." "And what if I am?" I challenged, my voice trembling slightly. "Then let go," she said. The command hung in the air, ambiguous and heavy. She didn't move to touch me, but the intent was there, hovering in the space between us. The silence that followed wasn't the empty silence of the mine. It was full. It was heavy. It was the sound of a question waiting to be answered. I didn't answer immediately. I couldn't. The command to let go felt dangerous, like stepping off a ledge without checking for a net. I stared into the dark liquid in my mug, watching the reflection of the harsh overhead light tremble with the microscopic shaking of my hands. "I don't know how," I admitted, the words scraping my throat like the dust from the mine. "I've spent 10 years building a life that looks perfect from the outside. It's a fortress of competence. If I let go, I'm terrified there won't be anything underneath but rubble." Renee didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell me I was wrong or that everything would be okay. Instead, she set her mug down on the small table with a deliberate, heavy click. She extended her left hand, the one I had been staring at, and turned it palm up. The light caught the jagged white line across her knuckles, illuminating the violence written into her skin. "You were looking at this," she stated, It wasn't a question. I whispered, feeling caught. 3 years ago, she said, her voice devoid of emotion, which made the story infinitely worse. A slide in the North Valley. Not a tourist. A local kid exploring where he shouldn't have been. The rain had been falling for 3 days. The mud was like wet concrete. I found him. I had his wrist. She closed her hand slowly, recreating the grip of a ghost. I had him. But I didn't have the leverage. The earth moved, and I didn't hold on. She opened her hand again. Empty. The safety line snapped back, she continued, tracing the scar with her other thumb, her eyes distant. Took the skin off to the bone. But that's not the part that hurts. The scar reminds me that intention isn't enough. Effort isn't enough. You have to be precise. You have to be stronger than the mountain. You have to be perfect, or the mountain collects. I looked at her face, stripped of its professional armor. The shadows under her eyes weren't just fatigue. They were grief, calcified into resolve. She wasn't unflinching because she was cold. She was unflinching because she had been broken, and she had rebuilt herself to ensure it never happened again. Her competence wasn't a talent. It was a penance. That's why you were so hard on me in the shaft, I realized, the pieces clicking into place. You weren't just doing a job. You were rewriting the ending. I don't lose people anymore, she said simply, her gaze snapping back to mine. I don't let go. The air in the trailer seemed to change then. It grew thinner, electric, charged with the kind of static you feel before a lightning strike. The smell of the storm outside was overpowered by the scent of us, damp wool, whiskey, and the sharp, metallic tang of truth. The heater hummed, but the warmth radiating from her was what I felt on my skin. I haven't lost anyone, I said, my voice steadying as the whiskey settled in my blood. But I haven't found anyone either. I have the career, I have the apartment with the view of the skyline, I have a phone that never stops buzzing with people who want things from me. But when I fell, when I was lying in the dark, pinned by that rock, I looked up, meeting her gray eyes, refusing to blink. I realized that if I died there, the only thing I'd really leave behind was a schedule. A perfectly organized calendar of meetings that didn't matter. Renee watched me, her gaze intense and unreadable. She wasn't looking at the scratches on my face or the bruise blooming on my shoulder anymore. She was looking at me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel evaluated for my utility or admired for what I could produce. I felt seen. The sensation was terrifying. It was a different kind of nakedness, far more exposing than stripping off wet clothes in front of a stranger. "You're not a schedule," she said softly. Her voice dropped an octave, vibrating in the small space between our knees. "You're the woman who held on in the dark. You're the pulse I felt under my thumb. You're the one sitting here, looking at me, like you know exactly what this silence means." I felt you too, I confessed. In the mine. It wasn't just the rescue. It was you. The way you anchored the world. "I know," she murmured. The distance between us was measured in inches now, but the emotional distance had collapsed entirely. The air felt heavy, pressurized, like the atmosphere inside a diving bell. Every breath I took tasted of her. Every beat of my heart was a response to hers. I had come to the mountain to find silence, to escape the noise of being known. But here, in this battered trailer, with the rain trying to drown the world outside, I was being known in a way that made the silence roar. The shiver started at the base of my spine, a treacherous, involuntary tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature in the trailer. The heater was humming steadily, filling the small metal box with a dry, artificial warmth, and the whiskey had already lit a fire in my blood. But when I looked at Renee, at the way she sat with that predatory stillness, watching me over the rim of her mug, my body betrayed me. I shivered violently, the movement rippling through my shoulders and making the heavy wool blanket slide just an inch down my arm. Renee tracked the movement. Her eyes didn't dart. They slid, heavy and inevitable, from my face to the bare skin of my shoulder, exposed by the slipping wool. She set her mug down. The sound was soft, a dull thud against the laminate table. But in the charged silence, it sounded like a gavel coming down. "You're still shaking," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of the conversational warmth we had built over the last hour. It was back to the command frequency, but deeper, rougher. "I'm not cold," I whispered. My throat felt tight, the words scraping their way out. "I didn't say you were cold." She stood up. In the confined space of the trailer, she felt massive, a sudden shift in the room's gravity. She took 2 steps, heavy, deliberate steps that closed the distance between us. She stopped right in front of me, her boots nearly touching my bare feet. I had to crane my neck to look up at her. She loomed, blocking out the harsh overhead light, casting me in her shadow. The smell of her was overwhelming now. The damp earth of the mine, the sharp tang of ozone from the storm, and that underlying, maddening scent of warm skin and vetiver. Renee reached out. I stopped breathing. I thought she was going to pull the blanket up, to cover me, to reestablish the professional boundary that had frayed into nothingness. She didn't. Her hand, that scarred, capable hand that had hauled me out of the earth, landed on the side of my neck. Her palm was rough, the calluses catching slightly on my soft skin. Her thumb rested against the pulse point of my throat, pressing down with a firm, steady weight. It wasn't a medical check anymore. It was a claim. "Your pulse is hammering," she murmured, her eyes locking onto mine. "You're terrified." "I'm not scared of the mine anymore," I managed to say, though my voice was barely a breath. "I know," she said. Her thumb stroked the line of my jaw, a slow, deliberate friction that sent a jolt of heat straight to my center. "You're scared of this. You're scared because you know I'm not going to just fix you and send you home. You know I see the cracks." "Renee," I breathed, her name feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue. "Tell me to stop," she challenged. Her hand slid lower, tracing the line of my collarbone, her fingers slipping beneath the edge of the blanket. The heat of her touch against my bare skin was shocking, a brand. "Tell me you want me to go back to the other side of the room and be the rescue chief." I looked at her, the dark hair falling loose around her face, the gray eyes that saw everything, the mouth that was set in a line of grim determination. I didn't want the rescue chief. I wanted the woman who understood the silence. I wanted the hands that knew how to break things apart. "Don't stop," I whispered. Renee didn't hesitate. She moved with the same terrifying efficiency she had used in the dark. She leaned down, her other hand tangling in the hair at the base of my neck, tilting my head back. She didn't close her eyes. She watched me until the very last second, forcing me to acknowledge exactly what was happening. When her mouth finally met mine, it wasn't gentle. It was a collision. It tasted of whiskey and dark coffee and raw need. I made a sound, a low, broken noise in the back of my throat, and opened to her. She took control instantly, her tongue sweeping into my mouth, tasting me, claiming the space. It was a kiss that demanded everything. It was slow, deep, and absolutely consuming. I reached up, my hands finding purchase on her shoulders, gripping the soft fabric of her thermal shirt. I pulled her closer, needing the weight of her. Renee groaned low in her chest, a vibration I felt against my own ribs, and followed the pull. She pressed me back against the metal wall of the trailer. The hard surface bit into my spine, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was the heat of her body pressing against mine, the solid, unyielding wall of muscle and intent. Her hands were everywhere. One moment they were tangling in my hair, anchoring me for the kiss. The next, they were sliding down my back, pressing me firmly against her. The roughness of her palms against my skin was an exquisite friction, a constant reminder of the strength she was holding back. She handled me with a dangerous kind of care, like I was something precious that she intended to devour. The blanket slipped from my shoulders, pooling uselessly at my waist. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need it. Renee's hands were on my waist now, her thumbs digging into the soft flesh, her fingers splaying wide over my ribs. She broke the kiss, gasping for air, her forehead resting against mine. We were both breathing hard, the sound harsh and ragged in the small room. "You have no idea," she rasped, her voice wrecked. "How long I've wanted to find something in the dark that wanted to be found." "I'm here," I answered, my hand sliding down to grip her biceps, feeling the tension coiled there. I'm right here. She pulled back just enough to look at me again. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the gray, dark with adrenaline and desire. She looked at my lips, swollen and wet, then down to my chest, rising and falling with frantic breaths. Then I'm not letting go, she promised. She kissed me again, harder this time, a desperate, hungry thing. Her hand slid under the hem of the blanket, finding the bare skin of my thighs. The touch was electric, grounding and terrifying all at once. The storm raged outside, hammering against our metal sanctuary, but it felt distant now, a dull roar compared to the blood rushing in my ears. I had come to the mountain for silence, but Renee was giving me a symphony of touch, of heat, of absolute, undeniable presence. I wasn't falling anymore. I was being caught, over and over again. The light was the first thing, sharp, clinical, and absolutely unforgiving. It sliced through the small rectangular window of the trailer, turning the floating dust motes into suspended diamonds and exposing every scratch on the brushed metal walls. I woke slowly, surfacing from a sleep so heavy it felt less like rest and more like a coma. The storm had finally broken. The relentless roar of the wind and rain was gone, replaced by a silence that felt fundamentally different than the one in the mine. That silence had been heavy, a suffocating prelude to death. This silence was clean. It was the quiet of a world washed new. I reached out instinctively, my hand seeking the solid heat that had anchored me through the night. The sheets were cool. The narrow bunk beside me was empty. I sat up, pulling the scratchy wool blanket tight against my chest. My body felt wrecked, muscles seizing, ribs aching, skin tender from the raw friction of the night. But my mind was terrifyingly clear. The static was gone. The constant buzzing anxiety of the city, the noise I had driven hours to escape, had been burned out of me. I felt grounded, heavy in the best possible way. Renee was standing at the counter. She was fully dressed, boots laced tight, back to her formidable self. She was pouring coffee into a travel mug, her movements precise and economical. She didn't look like she had slept. She looked like she had been standing guard, watching the perimeter while I drifted. "Road cruiser at the culvert," she said without turning around. Her voice was gravel, low and tired, but stripped of the harsh command tone. "They'll have a single lane open in 20 minutes. You can be back on the highway by noon." It was an out. She was giving me the logistics of my escape, handing me back to my life with professional efficiency. I watched the muscles in her back shift under her shirt as she secured the lid of the mug. I thought about the highway. I thought about the apartment with the view of the skyline, the emails piling up, and the phone that never stopped blinking. It felt like thinking about a past life, something that belonged to a stranger I didn't like very much. "I don't have anywhere to be at noon," I said, my voice raspy with sleep. Renee turned then. The morning sun caught the gray in her eyes, turning them to steel. She leaned against the counter, studying me, disheveled, wrapped in army surplus wool, sitting in her bed with my hair a disaster. "Everyone has somewhere to be. That's why you were running." I stood up. My legs were steady today. I walked across the small space, ignoring the bite of the cold floor on my bare feet. "I was running because I didn't know where the ground was," I told her. I stopped inches from her, entering her space without hesitation. The air between us wasn't frantic anymore. It was settled. "I know where it is now." She didn't move. She didn't retreat. "This isn't a vacation spot," she warned, though her hand twitched at her side, as if she wanted to reach out. "It's dust and danger and waiting for the next collapse. It's not a life for a tourist." "I know," I said. I reached out, tracing the scar on her hand, the white line that reminded her to never let go. "But it's quiet, and you're here." Renee stared at me for a long beat, the professional assessment warring with the woman who had pulled me into the dark. The woman won. She sighed, a surrender, and captured my hand, her grip firm and familiar. "Then don't go back to the highway," she said roughly. "Go get your car, bring it up here. The coffee's terrible, but the view is honest." "I'm not going back," I promised. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just saying words to fill the silence. I meant them. I looked back at the mine entrance as I stepped out into the cold air. It didn't look like a trap anymore. It looked like a door, a jagged threshold where the noise finally stopped. Sometimes you have to fall to find your footing. If you've ever found clarity in a crisis, subscribe for more stories of unexpected rescue.